Well, I think that it's very difficult to pin down the candidates on the basis of what they've said. There has been, perhaps particularly for Senator McCain, there has been quite an evolution in his position about what to do about the banking crisis. I believe the very first thing that he said was that we ought to fire the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and then he moved from there to wanting to orchestrate a bailout, and then now he is thinking more about sort of not so much a bailout of financial enterprises as thinking about homeowners. So there's been quite a bit of evolution, and my suspicion is that no matter who is elected, there will be quite a bit of evolution between the positions of the candidate now and I think the positions that will be adopted once that person is in government. So from my perspective, to go back to this little framework of organization that I gave, I think that it's very useful to try to apply that to the financial sector. And so how would I do that? Well, in this period between 1930, roughly, and the present, we have been in a broad era of deregulation of the banking business. And we have done that because we think that this no longer is a sector which needs to be treated specially, that it can be brought into the general regime of competitive markets. And so we have deregulated what banks can do. So for example, 25 years ago, banks were not necessarily allowed to set up branches wherever they wanted to. They certainly couldn't set up branches across state lines. They couldn't be present in more than one state. And in many states, they couldn't set up any branches at all. They could only do their banking business from one location. Each state had a different set of rules for branching, right? And similarly, banks had to limit their focus. They could either be an investment bank or they could be a commercial bank. They could do brokerage business, but they couldn't do all of these things together. They had to choose which segment of the banking business they were in. So what that meant was that banks were very specialized in what they did. And very broadly speaking, there's been a lot of deregulation of that over the past 25 years, so that now banks can be very broad, both geographically and in terms of the different products that they offer, okay? Maybe that deregulation was a good thing. Maybe it wasn't. But here's where what I said earlier comes into play. When you deregulate the banking business, that's a way of saying that you think that it ought to be subject to the ordinary rules that firms in other industries have to play by. And what are those other rules? Antitrust rules. Now, the banking industry has always been subject to the antitrust laws. But, and here's one little feature of the situation which is important to understand, in the regulatory era, it was not the Department of Justice that enforced the antitrust rules in the banking business, but it was the Treasury Department, or the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, or the Federal Reserve System. So every time banks wanted to merge, in addition to the Department of Justice, these other entities had to sign off on the merger. Now when you think about it for a moment, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the Federal Reserve Board, they have lots of regulatory responsibilities, and their identity is not bound up in promoting competition. It's the Justice Department that does that. So they were very willing to allow lots of mergers of banks to occur because their identity was not bound up in promoting competition. So guess what? These mergers led to the creation of banks which were too big to fail. And guess what? That's the situation that we found ourselves in. So what that suggests is that when we think about where we went wrong, maybe the problem was not so much that we deregulated, but the problem was that we didn't then go whole hog. We didn't then submit this industry to the same rules of competition that we submit my friends in the crushed peanut donut business to, all right? The rules were enforced differently, and we get different effects. And the reason why I suggest this as a possibility is that very much the same thing happened when we deregulated airlines. All right? Many people look at the airline business today and they say, aha, it's obvious we should not have deregulated. But the reasoning is based on a fallacy, and that is performance today is bad, we deregulated, therefore the reason why performance is bad today is because we deregulated. But there were other things that we did. When we deregulated, who was in charge of antitrust policy for airlines? Answer, the Department of Transportation. They are not oriented toward competition, so they allowed a lot of mergers to take place. Right here in Detroit, Northwest became a dominant player, not because Northwest at the moment of deregulation had a large market share, but because Northwest was allowed to merge with several other airlines, all of which had non-trivial shares of the Detroit market. So it could be that the problem was not so much deregulation as it was lax enforcement of the antitrust laws. That's why it's important as economists to think through what some of these alternative explanations might have been and to try to see which one is the most compelling. Until we do that, it's very difficult to know what either candidate should do moving forward, whether just preventing bank mergers is the best way to go, or whether we need to go the route of bailout, and if bailout, in which direction.